Hello and welcome to today's topic, classifying living things. In this lesson, we're going to discuss what are living things. Now, as we go through the topic of classifying living things, we want to keep the big idea in mind, and that is, how is the classification of living things related to the structure of their cells? Now, for this lesson, we're going to learn three things. Number one, what are living things? Number two, what do living things need? And number three, how are living things classified? So, as any lesson, let's start out with some key vocabulary. And the first word is autotroph. An autotroph is an organism that converts light energy to usable energy for that organism. In other words, light is like its food. Then you have heterotroph. A heterotroph is an organism that obtains energy from other organisms, such as ourselves. We consume other organisms in order to get energy. You also have habitat. A habitat is the place inside the ecosystem where the organism lives, and it provides everything that it needs to survive and reproduce. Now, you'll see these words biotic and abiotic. Biotic and abiotic are all the living and non-living things or factors that it needs in order to survive. Another word is binomial nomenclature. Now, binomial nomenclature is this naming system that gives each organism a two-word scientific name. You'll see this all the time. For example, we are Homo sapiens. You also have taxon. A taxon is simply a group of organisms. So now that we've done our key vocabulary, let's go ahead and begin our lesson. All right. Now, remember that all living things have 6 characteristics in common. 1, all living things are made of cells. Also, living things are organized. And living things have to grow and develop. And they also respond to their environment. Living things reproduce, and finally, living things use energy. So remember, to be defined as a living thing, you have to meet these 6 characteristics. So, key concept check. What are living things? Well, living things are made of cells, they're organized, they grow and develop, they respond to their environment, they reproduce, and they use energy. Those are living things. Now, some living things are unicellular. Unicellular means they're only made up of one cell. Many things, or many living organisms, are many cells, and we call these multicellular organisms. So unicellular is only one cell, whereas multicellular is more than one cell. All right? And you also should understand that multicellular organisms have varying levels of organization, the way we group them. Now, groups of cells that work together and perform a specific function are called tissues. All right? So you go from cells to tissues. And any tissues that work together and they do a specific function, we call those organs. All right? So cells that work together are called tissues. Tissues that work together are called organs. So you can see we're working our way up here. And then finally, organs that work together are called organ systems. So organs that work together are organ systems. So you start out with a cell, then you go to tissue, and tissue that works together goes to an organ, and organs that work together are called organ systems. Now, during their lifetimes, living things, as we said, they must grow, or basically increase in size, just like you do. They also develop and change over their lifetime. For example, they might go from larva to pupa. caterpillar to butterfly, or from baby to adult. So living things are constantly developing and are constantly growing. Now, we talked about autotrophs. Remember, autotrophs are organisms that convert light to energy. Most commonly, you would think of a plant. A plant is an autotroph. All right? Heterotrophs are organisms that obtain energy from other organisms. For example, us. What we do is we consume. We are consumers because we actually eat the autotrophs, or the plants, to give us nutrients and energy. Now, also understand that all organisms, when they detect something that changes outside, they will respond to that. All right? They change to match their external environment. For example, human beings, when it's hot out, we sweat. When it's cold out, we shiver. But I'm talking more also about long-term changes. So when you live in a certain area, you have a long-term environmental impact on the organisms. You ever seen fish that live deep down in the ocean where it's very, very dark? And they've adapted, and now they know how to see in the dark. Now, a specific environment where an organism lives is called a habitat. All right? And that habitat has to provide the food and water that it needs. For example, here's an example of a habitat. So, we're on to our next key concept, and that is, what do living things need? Well, we talked about that. All living things need a source of energy and a place to live. So they have to have a source of energy or food and a habitat, a place to live. So when we talk about all these organisms, because there's so many of them, scientists started to group them, and they grouped them based on similar traits, and then they came up with a naming system. And that naming system is binomial nomenclature. And it gives every living thing a two-word scientific name. For example, as I mentioned earlier, we are Homo sapien. If you're talking about a wolf, it is Canis lupus. So they give names to all of this. And then they have a varying structure that they work with. So the branch of science that deals with naming all these organisms out there and giving them their names is called taxonomy. And when we group organisms together, it's called a taxon. Now, using taxonomy, science has divided all living things on Earth into three groups that they call domains. All right? Domains are divided into kingdoms, and then phyla, then classes, order, family, genus, and species. So it just keeps getting more and more specific as you work down the list. So here's an example of an organism called the eastern chipmunk. All right? We all call it the eastern chipmunk, but it has a very, very, specific name. So you can see that in the domain Eukarya, there are about 4 to 10 million species, and some of them have nothing to do with chipmunks. This is a chipmunk, right? That looks like fungus. So you can see that it starts to get more specific, because then we go down to Animalia kingdom, right? And then that goes down to about 2 million. So it kind of pushes out all the plants. So now we've got, some insects and fish. Looks like there's a tiger, some squirrels, etc. So then they go down to the phylum, which is Chordata. And now we're down to about 50,000 species. All right, so they've gotten rid of some of them. And then they go down to the class, which is Mammalia. And now they're down to 5,000. And then they just keep going down and down till finally they've got the actual eastern chipmunk, which is what we call it, and is Tamias striatus. That is the binomial nomenclature name of the eastern chipmunk. Now, how do they decide how these organisms are named and grouped, etc.? Well, they use something called a dichotomous key. Now, a dichotomous key is a tool, and it's used for them to ask questions and then narrow down what they think it is. So basically, they use it to classify organisms based on descriptions of traits. So for an example, you have an organism, right? And you say, well, does it have 6 legs or does it not have 6 legs? If it does not have 6 legs, it goes off in another direction. If it does have 6 legs, you ask the next question. Does it have antenna? If it doesn't have antenna, then you have your answer. If it does have antenna, then you go to the next stage. And it says, does it have large hind legs for hopping? Yes. Well, then it is a grasshopper. Or no large hind legs for hopping. Well, then it is an ant. So ants are 6 legs, antenna, and no large legs for hopping. Grasshoppers are 6 legs, antenna, but large hind legs for hopping. So that's kind of how they classify them and group them. So how are living things classified? That's our next key concept. Well, to classify living things, we use taxonomy, and then we start to divide living things up. All right? Everything is divided into 3 domains. And then from there, the domains are further divided into kingdoms, phyla, classes, orders, families, genera, and species. Species being the final one. So in summary, all living things grow, develop, and produce. All living things are organized, they respond to their environment, and they use energy. And scientists use a classification system to group organisms with similar traits and genetic makeup. So that's your lesson on what are all living things. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next lesson.